We welcome you to our Jasna Southwest Region presentation on February 22nd, 2025. This presentation is by Cecily Van Cleave, a member of Jasna from the Eastern Washington, Northern Idaho region. Her presentation is titled Beyond the Garden Wall, Priscilla Wakefield, Women in Botany, and the Intersection of Art and Science During the Austen Era. This is a recording of a Zoom presentation Cecily gave to the Southwest region. Apologies for the abruptness of the beginning of the recording of the video.
Since we're at that point in time for doing that. So that's how I came to this topic, is through research for the novel, and then developed this presentation on Priscilla Wakefield for the AGM in 2022. So Priscilla Wakefield is a figure. She was an actual historical figure who I found as I was doing research on kind of leading women in science during the Georgian era. And my book is fictional, the character is fictional. There aren't a lot of real historical figures in it. It's set in the Regency and the Georgian era, but I couldn't resist, and I just had to put a fictional version of Priscilla Wakefield in the book. So she features in that, and I hope I've done her justice. You know, the actual Priscilla Wakefield, I hope she would think that the way that she was portrayed was acceptable. So she's kind of the central focus of our talk today because of that. As you'll see, she was quite an interesting woman. So a few of the topics we'll cover today we're going to start with kind of a broad lens of what was happening with the Enlightenment period and what did that mean for women's education, literacy, their ability to understand and participate in science at that time. And then we will go through a couple of quick examples of women who were involved during the Georgian era, involved with science to some extent. Then we'll take a look at women's botanical writing of that time and talk about some common themes, common features that those works have. And then we'll focus in on Priscilla Wakefield and use her as a case study of what women were able to accomplish in this time within the realm of science and activism as well. Priscilla Wakefield was not only an author, she was also an activist and had quite a few charitable undertakings that were very long-lasting and had an impact on her community and the country of England as well. So our focus is definitely Georgian England today, as that's just where a lot of my research was taking place. That's where my novel is set. But there's certainly other examples from other cultures, other countries as well. And then we'll do a brief comparison of Wakefield and Austen, just because I think it's interesting to compare the two of them as figures, women writers within this Regency era. And then to wrap up, we'll extend our gaze beyond Georgian era and look to what was happening with women in science as we entered the Victorian time period. So I know that's a lot. I'll try and keep us moving through it, and we can definitely go back if you have questions at the end and we need to skim back to something, we can definitely do that. So to begin our discussion, I think it's helpful to recognize that there was a really long-standing association between women and plants, flowers, gardens, the natural world, and that dates all the way back to antiquity. So as we enter the time period of the Enlightenment, the idea that women, flowers, gardens were connected to each other would have been fairly familiar to European societies, because they have this tradition of, for example, personifying the goddess Flora as a maiden. And you can see her in this illustration crowning a bust of Carl Linnaeus. And she's the young girl in a white dress who's awarding Carl Linnaeus this garland of flowers. So the idea of women maybe being able to enter this world of studying flowers and plants was aided by the fact that flora was often, associated with innocence and purity and other desirable feminine attributes. And just the visual idea of her being this young, innocent maiden would have made it a little bit easier for people to make this transition to then women studying the natural world through botany. We can also see other mythological figures in this illustration that are representative of different areas of society that were impacted by Carl Linnaeus's work. So Carl Linnaeus, as you may know, was responsible for developing the binomial naming system that we still use in science. So when we refer to something by a genus and species, that whole classification system was the result of Carl Linnaeus's work, and that's called the Linnaean system of classification. And that really standardized science across cultures. It presented a view of the world and of the natural world and the sciences that was a structured way to go about describing the natural world. And that will tie into some of those cultural values that were promoted during the Enlightenment through education. So we have these other figures are Aesculapius, the man on the left of that illustration, and he represents physicians and healing. So those areas were impacted by Carl Linnaeus's work. We have Flora, as I mentioned, the young girl in the white dress there. And then the woman in green on the right is Ceres, and she's the Roman goddess of agriculture and grains. So you can see that we have this recognition that a lot of these areas of study were impacted by Linnaeus's work, by this kind of burgeoning study of science and classification, taxonomy, and that women were not necessarily excluded from that because we have these, visuals of these female figures who kind of helped actual women participate in that realm. The author Anne Chatier has pointed this out. She says that during the 18th and 19th centuries, cultural linkages like these between flora and gardens with women and nature helped smooth the path for women into botanical work of many kinds. So that kind of sets the stage for women participating in science a bit more. And then I don't think we can understand the impact that education had on women like Priscilla Wakefield without sort of looking at the Enlightenment in a broad sense. So scholars usually put the bookends for this time period of about 1685 to 1815. So that encompasses the whole 18th century. And there were a few important cultural things that were happening at this time across, in England certainly, but also across Europe. And some of those had to do with the changes in printing technology that made it more affordable, more attainable to create more printed reading texts to be read, and that also implied that there was an audience to receive those texts. So what we also began to see through the Enlightenment is an increase in education for a greater swath of society. So traditionally, education, literacy, being able to read, write, understand written texts, participate in intellectual discussions was pretty limited to men and to a small subset of men, so within a certain class. And then in the Enlightenment, we begin to see that cultures think that it's desirable for more people to have access to education, to approach education as something that women and girls can participate in, have access to. And then kind of combined with that greater literacy comes a greater effort to make education more understandable and attainable to that broader swath of society. And we can see that in things like the schools meant to educate the working classes begin to increase during this time. And also the female literacy rates for certainly middle and upper class women begin to rise through the 18th century. There are estimates of
10% would be 459.
18%
and half of that
of women would have been literate. That's an estimate that we have from the late 1600s, early 1700s. And by the end of the 18th century, that literacy rate for women is maybe more around 40%. So still not what we would call universal literacy. And certainly within the upper and middle classes, that's probably where we would see the highest rates of literacy because families had the resources to educate their daughters. But that is more than double what we had seen at the beginning of that time period. So that shows us that education is increasing, literacy is increasing. We're also going to begin to see within science itself a greater emphasis on standardization, rationality, having really structured ways to understand different disciplines. Different scientific disciplines are really developing things like chemistry, botany, certainly biology as a whole we're seeing developments in this century that will make them more, I suppose, more central to the lives of women than they would have been maybe in previous generations. And one sign of this is we begin to see female characters that are interested or involved in science in various plays of that time period, the late 1600s and early 1700s. And I just have a short list on the slide here of some examples of those. But it's interesting because we do see that there's a presence of women that are interested in science, but they're often portrayed in a kind of ridiculed or satire is used to sort of suggest that these women are maybe not quite natural or not quite, they're sort of anomalies. This is something that we can kind of poke fun at. So we can see that there's this tension between we want our society to be more educated. We want to have educated wives and daughters. We want our daughters to be able to converse with their husbands, and that's sort of a status symbol. But we also see this tension of we're not really sure what to make at this point, what to make of women that are interested in science. And we also have just kind of larger debates about women's abilities, women's intellectual capacity, the proper roles and the ways for them to express that. And we can see that in other works like Mary Wollstonecraft, her work as a whole, and her Vindication of the Rights of Women, which she wrote in 1792. So really, this is a time of change. The Enlightenment is a time of change for women, just as all eras have their facets of change. But this is something that would equip women like Priscilla Wakefield to do the work that they did. So I think it's important to sort of lay that foundation and say, this is the result of previous efforts that had been made in the 18th century. And as you'll see when we talk about Priscilla Wakefield, she's really squarely placed in that Enlightenment time period. So that being said, where did scientific women fit within this culture? And we do have examples of women that really made a name for themselves within scientific realms. But as we'll see, it was not a default. It was not something that every, village woman was interested in or had exposure to. These were often, women from higher classes, middle or upper class women whose families were able to ensure that they were educated to the extent that they could read scientific texts. That was not as easy as it might be today, because a lot of the texts were written in Latin or relied on someone's ability to understand Latin. So that in itself was a sign that someone had received extensive education in that language, until we get into more of the 19th century with more things written in the vernacular language. So these three women are just a subset of more examples of women who were participating in science during that kind of long 18th century and into the 19th century. There's other names as well. Mary Anning was a paleontologist who worked on the Devon coast. And she, I believe, was from working class background. So not only did she have this sort of tension because she was a woman and putting out this work and finding these fossils, but she also had that maybe stigma of her class against her as well. Ethelred Bennett was another geologist. We have examples of botanists who were women in the United States at this time. Quite a few came from Scotland. There are examples of in Ireland as well of women that studied seaweed and lichens. So these three that I have here on the slide are certainly not meant to be the only examples of achievement in science at this time, but I do think they're maybe some of the more well-known examples of scientists at that time, or people that were interested in the natural sciences. On the left, we have Elizabeth Blackwell, who was born early in that Enlightenment period. She was born in 1707, and she was responsible for really starting to codify and write down a lot of the traditional medical remedies that had been used throughout previous centuries to treat various things, to treat, in a medical context. And often those were skills that were developed and passed on by women. So through midwifery or other kind of healing occupations that would have taken place, in a village, informally, in rural areas. Elizabeth Blackwell began to write some of these down, to collect them. She did her own illustrations for this book, and it was very, very popular and very well received at that time. So she's sort of a forerunner of the botanical work that other women were able to do later on. So that was an important kind of move towards things beginning to be recorded and documented. Of course, then they also entered the realm or the space where they could be, taken and used by people that may or may not have made good use of them, but they, that's just what happens with the circulation of information, I suppose. So then we have Caroline Herschel in the middle here, and she was an astronomer. I believe she was born in Germany and then moved to England after she was married. And she made quite a few contributions to astronomy. And then Mary Somerville on the right here was Scottish. Many of you may have heard of her. She worked in what we would today call physics, and then was also a mathematician and an astronomer. So very accomplished within the scientific realm. Caroline Herschel and Mary Somerville were the first two women who were admitted to, I believe it was one of the scientific bodies, maybe the Royal Society of London, as kind of honorary fellows in, I think, the 1830s. So they were some of the first two women to be formally recognized for the work they had done within science. But it's really interesting because Mary Somerville herself kind of believed that she was not capable and that women were not capable of making entirely original contributions to science. She wrote, "I was conscious that I had never made a discovery myself. I had no originality. I have perseverance and intelligence, but no genius. That spark from heaven is not granted to my sex." So even though women were kind of finding a way to move forward and participate in science to some extent, they may have regarded themselves as not being the equals of men in that regard, of creating original content or kind of developing their own knowledge. They may have seen themselves as being capable of following in the path behind men that had developed this kind of formalized science. So we see that tension again between women starting to take a step towards participation, but also there were beliefs in the culture that may have made them feel as if they had a different role to play, a different set of abilities than men did who were involved in the same fields. So it's kind of an interesting, there's some nuances to what was happening at this time as women were starting to dip a toe into the scientific waters, so to say. So these women were involved in different scientific disciplines that they could study within the domestic realm. So they would have had access to equipment like a telescope or a microscope. They could do this work at home. And as we'll see, that was important to maintain that desirable trait of, being within the domestic realm, this idea of being kind of retiring, this idea of this knowledge all sort of being centered in the private realm. So these women used that to their advantage. They studied those things that they were able to study. And as we mentioned before, there's an advantage to women who wish to enter botany because there are these long-standing cultural associations between women, gardens, girls, that idea of femininity and the natural world, especially as portrayed through flowers and plants. So that being said, we do have examples of women who were starting to create botanical works at this time. So that late 18th century, early 19th century time period. We would not put that work does not often have the characteristics of what we would call scientific research today. So we say that women were botanists, and they certainly had a great understanding of botany as it existed at that time, but they were often not advancing their own theories. They were not often entering this realm of study with the view of, I'm going to do this research, I'm going to have these papers published. It was often more in a way that was more aligned with gender ideals of that time. And so we can see in these women's work that there are some common features that they often employ, one of which is a maternal or educational authority. And so as education was increasing throughout the Enlightenment period and into the Georgian era, it began to be desirable for women or mothers to help educate their children, so to be involved with what their children were studying at home, especially because often children were not, they were tutored at home or educated at home, especially girls. That was much more common for girls. And so mothers needed to be equipped or taught how to teach their children science and botany. And that's the aim of a lot of these botanical works, is to help whoever's educating children to teach them the technical aspects of that. Another thing that we begin to see is that these authors use female characters and figures to do that. And that I think reflects that it was possible for women to be seen as an authority and to be situated within this scientific and botanical realm. And that, again, probably was aided by that ancient association between women and flowers and plants. That was not a leap of huge intellectual idea to get there, to use these female characters and figures in the books. They often use a familiar format. So they'll use letters or a dialogue or some kind of narrative to help introduce the subject matter to their audience. So instead of a traditional, what we would think of as a traditional textbook format with just here are the facts, we have this introduction of literary structure to help convey the technical information. And Priscilla Wakefield used that in her botany book that she wrote. These are almost always aimed at a juvenile market. So again, meant for education, people who are helping teach young students about botany. They always incorporate the religious and gender ideals of their day. So there's often a discussion of Christianity, a creator God who has created this botanical world that the characters are studying. There's also often a lot of discussion of the idea that a woman can study this field, a girl can study this realm of study and not give up her modesty, her desirability as a marriage partner or as a mother and a wife. So again, kind of using those cultural values to advance the knowledge of women, but definitely within the parameters of that culture. And then because it was, of course, not seemly or not acceptable yet for women to be kind of seen as authorities or discussing sexual reproduction, which was itself not well understood at that time. There are often oblique references or no reference to the central tenet of botany, which is, the idea that pollination is happening because it's part of sexual reproduction. So I wouldn't suggest using these texts as science reference today. We understand a lot more about genetics and sexual reproduction, but that's important I think it's important because it characterizes these works as a step forward within those kind of mainstream values and ideas of Georgian England and similar societies. So with that in mind, we can look at Priscilla Wakefield and the work that she was able to do. So Priscilla Wakefield was born kind of squarely in the middle of the 18th century, 1751. So she certainly would have benefited from Enlightenment era education and exposure to those values of education and rationality and a greater intellectual rigor for more people, including women and girls. She was born to a prominent Quaker family in the London area, and she was the eldest of 10 children. So early on, she was involved in educating her younger siblings, and that, as we'll see, that equipped her really well to then create works that were meant to educate children, educate young people. She married the merchant Edward Wakefield in 1771, and they moved out of the core of London to the village of Tottenham, which is today a suburb of London, but at that point was still kind of a rural village on the outskirts of London. And then they eventually had 3 children, and Priscilla was involved in educating them as well. So she kind of educated several generations of her siblings and then her children. This portrait that you see on the screen is Priscilla and Edward probably soon after they were married. So Edward, of course, has the blue coat, and Priscilla is on the right in the pink gown. And then the woman in the middle, I think, is one of Priscilla's sisters. So we have them portrayed, and you can tell that they're certainly middle class, and that they are well connected enough to have their portrait painted. I believe this was done by another Quaker artist of the time, and they were well connected within the Quaker community. Edward Wakefield was a Quaker as well. So we see them in their early life here. This is their house, Sunnyside in Tottenham. You can see that it's probably the home of a fairly prosperous middle-class family. It would have been appropriate for their social standing as they understood it and as people perceived it. Sunnyside is not standing anymore. I think it was demolished in the early 1900s, but this is a photograph that we have of that house before it was demolished. These images dealing with Priscilla Wakefield come from a website that's run by local historians in Tottenham. So they have a great source of information about Priscilla Wakefield. And I recommend looking at that if you want to know more about Priscilla Wakefield. So Priscilla Wakefield is living in this village. She begins to embark on a writing career, and that is necessitated by Edward Wakefield's apparently very poor business skills. So we have this example with other botanical and scientific women where the husbands are not able to support the family entirely by themselves. And so women need to help contribute to the family income. And that was the case for Priscilla Wakefield through Edward's business, perhaps lack of competence. The Priscilla Wakefield website is very harsh on Edward Wakefield. He is not portrayed very flattering and a very flattering light in that website, but there are many references in Priscilla's journals to her needing to go to London, her to be involved in the bankruptcy suits of Edward, and then one of their sons was often in bankruptcy court. So they really had a long period of financial insecurity that Priscilla was trying to offset with her ability to write educational books. And as we'll see, she was very successful in doing that. So this is the fourth book that she wrote. It's called An Introduction to Botany in a Series of Familiar Letters. And this was published in 1796. So she already had started a writing career at this point, but this is one of her first scientific books that she wrote. And it's been called by scholars as, or identified as, the first botany book written by a woman to provide a systematic introduction to the science. So this was important because it made that knowledge about botany more accessible to students, and it took what was written in other places and translated it in a way that would have been accessible to juvenile audiences who were learning at home with a governess or their mother or some other figure. And what Priscilla Wakefield did is take information from Sowerby and Smith's English Botany, which was written for adults, and she translates that information, that technical knowledge, into a juvenile book that's structured differently. It has those familiar letters. The concept of the book is that it's letters between two sisters, one of whom is learning botany from her governess and the other one is away. And so the one who's learning is teaching her sister through these letters. So we see a lot of those tenets of women's botanical writing at the time with female characters. This is structured in letters. It's also really designed to present technical information in a different way. So this was a forerunner of other books that would be written after Priscilla Wakefield. It was very successful. It was on publishers' lists for 45 years after it was published. It went through French and American editions. It was really, it took hold really well, and she obviously was able to identify that this might be successful because it builds on these ideals of education, rationality, in a way that is usable for someone who's educating children at home. It also kind of reveals some of her attitudes about women and girls at the time. In the introduction, she says, "May botany become a substitute for some of the trifling, not to say pernicious, objects that too frequently occupy the leisure of young ladies of fashionable manners, and by employing their faculties rationally, act as an antidote to levity and idleness." So here she's showing her intent that this will help better young women as they study this more intellectually rigorous subject. The author Anne Chatier says that this familiar format of the book, with its domestic setting and familial cast of characters, authorizes female scientific curiosity. Her girls look at plants, are intellectually active, and teach one another in a sisterly relationship that includes shared intellectual enthusiasms. This may be the delight of the Quaker in the wonders of the natural world. It is also a woman's delight in the pursuit of knowledge, as well as a woman writer's satisfaction in cultivating new markets for her literary and scientific work. So quite a lot going on here with this work, this introduction to botany. Priscilla Wakefield as a whole was a very successful writer. She was clearly able to support her family, help support her family with the profits from her books. And we'll talk broadly about her career at the end here. So the botany book was definitely notable, especially within this discussion of women in science and botany of the time. We also have another kind of interesting book that she wrote. It must have been soon after she wrote the introduction to botany. This is called Reflections on the Present Condition of the Female Sex, with Suggestions for Its Improvement. So she wrote this in 1798. It was published in 1798. This was her only book that she wrote for an adult audience. So this is really meant to be an expression of her philosophy or her ideas about women's roles, women's disadvantages, and she comes out with all guns blazing here. She takes on Adam Smith and his economic theories kind of in the very first page. She says, "It is asserted by Dr. Adam Smith that every individual is a burden upon the society to which he belongs, who does not contribute his share of productive labor for the good of the whole." So Priscilla Wakefield in this book kind of tears apart that argument because she thinks it excludes the work that women were doing that did not result in a concrete, tangible product. So she thinks that Smith's work is really biased towards the work of men who produced a lot of the goods and really tangible assets of a society. But she points out that the work that women did, like raising children, educating children, caring for maybe the poor or the sick through charitable endeavors, and running a household, those things were also beneficial, but did not result in this tangible result that Adam Smith would be able to use in his ideas to measure productivity. So this was important because it was probably the first time that a woman had ever addressed those aspects of Smith's argument. And she also in this work kind of develops her argument or her ideas about women's disadvantages as really being rooted in inadequate education rather than and cultural custom rather than natural ability. So she says, "The indolent indulgence and trifling pursuits in which those who are distinguished by the appellation of gentlewomen often pass their lives may be attributed with greater probability to a contracted education, custom, false pride, and idolizing adulation than to any defect in their intellectual capacities." So this is, if we scroll or sort of skim through the table of contents of this book, we can see that she's introducing ideas that were intended to provide different opportunities for women than they had at that time period. and pointing out unjust or discrimination basically based on the fact of someone's gender. So she says, pointing out the characteristic perfection of the mental qualifications of both sexes, and the necessity which there is for the talents of women being directed toward procuring an independent support. So we'll see that in her other work that we'll talk about in a minute. She was very, very focused on helping women, working class women, lower class women, and girls with being able to support themselves or contribute to the support of their family if they needed to. And that was true for women that remained single, for women that were widowed, or for women like herself whose families had fallen on financial difficulties. And she says it's a beneficial thing for girls and women to receive this kind of training, this encouragement to develop their skills in a way that they can use to benefit themselves and their families. We can also see some other topics covered in this book, centering the giving of greater rewards to men than women for similar exertions of time, labor, and ingenuity. I think that's maybe a forerunner of equal pay for equal work. So we have that, an early example of that from Priscilla Wakefield. In another chapter, she talks about creating a female college, select day schools, and then also mentions schools of industry, which we'll see in this next section. So in addition to being an author, contributing to botany, Wakefield was also a very involved activist, and she wrote 17 books over the course of her career. Almost all but the one that we just looked at were for children and young people. So she was taking advantage of her status as an educated woman who was also a wife and a mother and was educated and literate, and who eventually developed this successful publishing career. So she was very prolific, wrote those 17 books. Most of them, I believe she wrote an entomology book, which is where you see this grasshopper illustration coming from. But she mostly wrote on different topics, including travel writing, which was very lucrative at that time. We had, people's accounts of different countries and areas of the world, and she was able to use their correspondence and accounts to, again, translate that to a juvenile audience. And those were her most successful and lucrative books in her career. She was paid £200 for the manuscript of her European travel book, which was believed to be the highest fee ever given to an author by her publisher. So that shows that she was very savvy with the literary spaces that she was entering and being successful in. As a Quaker, the Quaker community was really involved in the abolition movement in England, and Priscilla Wakefield joined that community and called to have slavery-produced goods like sugar and cotton be boycotted. So she was involved with those kind of social justice issues of her day. And then she also was involved with educating and empowering girls and women within Tottenham and across England. So she created a maternal charity for postpartum mothers. Often they were working class women who were maybe in domestic service. And she believed, based on research that she had read, probably from other countries like Germany, that had these maternal lying-in homes, that it was beneficial for them and for society if they had a chance to recover after childbirth rather than going back to physically demanding jobs right after they had given birth. So that was an effort that an institution that she created in Tottenham. She also founded a school of industry for girls. So what we saw on that last slide where she was talking about that in her book, she created one in Tottenham that taught girls a trade. So that allowed them to then rely on that skill for themselves or for their families in the future. And then she also founded, as if that wasn't enough, she founded the first savings bank in England, which was the kind of a pension fund and also what we would call like a microloan institution. And this was the first documented savings bank in England. And it also served as a pension fund for women who could no longer work and had to retire. So they would pay into this fund and then receive a pension afterwards. And then the Female Benefit Club that was part of that was kind of the microloan arm. So they said that they provided loans to purchase necessaries at the wholesale price, or to provide the funds for women to provide themselves with articles for sale, materials for work, a pig, or any other thing likely to produce a profit. These loans are repaid in small monthly amounts. So I would say within all these activities, within her writing, we certainly see this overarching theme of greater education for girls and young people, and also to assist women and girls in preparing themselves for independence in some whatever form that took for them. So I would say that's more irons in the fire than I would ever want to have. But she seemed to think that she should be doing more. She wrote in 1798, "Yesterday completed my 47th year. The thought should stimulate me to give greater diligence in the great business of my existence. How much there is to do and how little time to do it in." That's kind of an overview of Priscilla Wakefield, things she accomplished in her lifetime. It's certainly a high level presentation of what she did. And if you're interested in learning more about her life and the nuances and the details, I encourage you to check out the website that's put out by the Tottenham historians. And I'll link to that in my slide of resources. So now I think it's great to I was drawn to this era of time when I was writing my novel because of Jane Austen and her work. And so I thought it would be interesting to sort of put these two women together and make a few comparisons between them and look at what they were doing, their work. There's similarities in their work, certainly. But of course, there are some differences in Jane Austen and Priscilla Wakefield. And I think one of the largest differences may have come from just the fact that Priscilla Wakefield was raised as a Quaker and continued that faith and that connection to that religious philosophy throughout her life. Because Quakers were really known for being at the forefront of science, both for men and then at times women. They believed that education was desirable for both sexes. They believed that men and women were equal. And so I think Priscilla Wakefield took those values that were presented to her and that she upheld through her life, and that placed her in a place where she could be involved and speak to these maybe more socially minded areas. Not to say that Austen didn't do that in her work. I would say it's more oblique or more just less explicit in the work. I would say that maybe the fact that Jane Austen was the daughter of a Church of England clergyman may have sort of encouraged her to write about certain topics or certain subjects in a different way, let's say. And I was doing some research on kind of how the Church of England was perceived at that time and how people within it might have, made suppositions about maybe what was acceptable. And basically, Church of England was mainstream. It was the government's church. And one scholar that I read states that the Church of England viewed itself as an adjunct of the state and a guarantor of social stability. So I think, I mean, there's certainly exceptions to those communities and those faiths, but I do think it probably shaped each of their inclinations to pursue different topics or different subjects. That being said, they were both very successful writers, and I'm sure we know that Priscilla Wakefield was sort of actively looking for lucrative new directions to take her writing in these travel books for sure. And so I think there are a lot of similarities in the sense that they were middle class. They both benefited from this Enlightenment era of greater education. We know that Jane Austen was well educated, was exposed to Latin and Greek by her father and things like that. So I think they both benefited from the Enlightenment efforts in the sense that they were educated. They were also, because of their middle class status, were probably in that spot where they were educated, but also experienced financial need. And that would have driven them to use their talents and their skills in writing to benefit their families and provide security for themselves. So I wish I had proof that, Jane Austen read Wakefield's work and she had a copy that she took everywhere with her, but I have not seen any evidence that Jane Austen read Priscilla Wakefield's Introduction to Botany or Reflections on the Female Sex or anything. I think it's likely that Jane Austen could have read the Botany book because she would have been in that age range where Priscilla Wakefield was envisioning that her audience could learn this at home or on their own. And that could have included women who were in their late teens and early 20s, which I think is about the age that Jane Austen would have been. So I'll keep seeing if there's any evidence that they were, knew of each other's work or anything like that. I don't think there is. I know they were contemporaries through their lives overlapping. Priscilla Wakefield died after Jane Austen, of course, who died very young. But I think it's interesting to kind of see these different ways that women across different, social circumstances were able to create some kind of career for themselves as writers. And they were certainly both able to do that in different ways. So now we'll leave the Georgian era behind as we wrap up our talk. Looking ahead to the Victorian era, it becomes much more, it was always difficult for women to kind of contend with cultural ideals that were not in favor of them being scientific or making contributions to science. I would say I view the Georgian era as kind of this time when some progress was made in the sense that women were seen as authorities in an educational sense. They were seen as being capable of understanding science and passing it on. But in the Victorian era, science as a whole becomes more professionalized. And what that means is that women are excluded from a lot of the professional activities of science, even more so and in a more kind of formalized way than they were in the Georgian era. So we see this in things like the Royal Society restricting its membership only to men, which meant that women could not, I believe they could attend meetings, but they couldn't present papers. They couldn't really participate fully in the work of those scientific bodies. And those bodies became the main places that science was happening, just as the whole scientific world became more professionalized in England. And this created, as I said, a greater resistance to women participating in that. We also have the evolution of different ideals about gender that kind of place upper class and middle class women in the home in a very domestic sphere. And so that the fact that there are then these professional opportunities outside of the home in a more public sphere prevents them again from fully participating in that. I mentioned the Royal Society a minute ago. They were founded in 1660, and women were not permitted to become fellows until 1945, 285 years after the society was founded. So that just shows it took a long time for women to attain that kind of equal status in the scientific world with men. And there was a bias against women by some very prominent scientists of the time. So Thomas Henry Huxley wrote to Charles Lyell, the geologist, that 5/6 of women will stop in the dull stage of evolution to be the stronghold of parsonism, the drag on civilization, the degradation of every important pursuit in which they mix themselves, intrigues in politics, and friponnées in science. So definitely the challenges continued. I do think the Georgian era was important for women in science because it did represent a legitimate authority in scientific matters that was not just restricted to the family or the private sphere. So through these works that women were publishing, they were able to sort of breach that public-private boundary. And I think that was important. It certainly introduced new opportunities for women that some really needed to take advantage of, as in Priscilla Wakefield's case. And I think the fact that we have these women and that scholarship is, starting to recognize these women within that Georgian era is a sign that they did make a mark and their work was important. It just would take a long time for culture to really level the playing field, if it has to this day. So with that, I have a resource slide. I'm happy to share that in an email. I know it's probably hard to jot everything down. So I can do that. I can send that out or have the chapter send it out in an email. If you want to learn more about any of this, it's a huge topic, a fascinating but very broad topic for sure. And then I'd love to take any questions if anyone has anything they'd like to ask.
Hello, I'm Leah. I guess we'll start the Q&A session.
Awesome.
So foremost, thank you, Cecily, for your presentation. This has gotten a lot of questions from the audience, so bear with me as I go through 12 of them.
Okay.
So first question, and also post it in the chat. Before the Enlightenment period, what did women do? Could you ask me, as a modern woman, what it is like for women back then to entertain themselves? What were the typical role models for women before the Enlightenment period?
Oh,
that's science.
That's a great question. As I mentioned earlier, in the centuries preceding the Enlightenment, women were involved. I mean, they were herbalists. They had this maybe, there was this maybe association between women who knew how to make remedies, medicines from plants. And that would have been true in rural areas, especially because the medical field as a whole was really not developed like it is today, or like it would be in the 19th century and 18th centuries as well. So I do think there was probably a few opportunities for women to participate in that, maybe as an apprentice or a midwife of some kind in the village. As far as intellectual role models, I mean, literacy was really very low at that time for women and men both. So I think probably the vast majority of people would not have had an idea of an intellectual life, in the sense that I have these books and I'm reading them and I'm sort of developing these ideas, and then I'm going to write them down, or I'm going to write a letter to someone about them. I don't think there was really that formalized sense just because the society was not very literate. And that, as I mentioned, was improved by printing technology that then, was kind of the chicken and the egg. You had a more literate society, but there was greater access to text. And so that led to, continuing this move towards greater education. But yeah, I mean, I know like theater would have been something that people would have participated in across classes because you didn't have to be able to read to enjoy theater. So you could see, a play and discuss it with people you knew, but that would have been very informal. So yeah, I mean, I think just a lot of women in most classes probably would have been laborers, or there really wouldn't have been this development of educational resources to help them at that time. So I think it's just a different world than the one we know, and a different set of expectations that people would have both for themselves. I mean, your life expectancy was also probably pretty low at that time. So you may not have really even had this concept of education being for you if you were in the middle or lower classes. There are exceptions, of course. Upper class women certainly were more literate than the lower classes. Does that answer the question?
So,
Yeah.
but along those lines, the next question, who taught these scientific women? Was it mainly self-taught, or were they formally taught? I'm assuming that since most of them were rich, that they could afford professors to teach them.
Yeah. So often with these women, their fathers would be involved in science, or their brothers. There would be some male family member whose work they would be able to like assist with, or they'd be exposed to books through their brothers. I would say most women, or most girls of that time, were being educated by a governess, or at home by a parent. So that could be the father or the mother. So a lot of it probably did come from these early scientific works that then were that information was kind of given to them in a way that maybe was not always ideal or standardized, or there's probably a range of like quality of conveyance of the information. But these women were able to kind of cobble that together, I guess, into something that they could then use as they were entering their adult lives. So I would say like the botany book that Priscilla Wakefield wrote, she had to have been able to understand what was in the source text, not only to understand it, but then also to translate it into the familiar format, kind of make it appropriate for younger audiences. So I think that says that it was probably a mix of like family exposure and education, and self, reading books and being able to sort of do work based on the work that other people had done. But yeah, it was probably very informal and haphazard, I would say, until we kind of get into the greater access of, or the greater number of botanical works and scientific works that are meant for children, and that would kind of increase the exposure in the next generation.
I see. Okay, next question. Do you think Mary Somerville had imposter syndrome? She seemed so accomplished, but it's surreal to hear her. She didn't think herself or other women could think of themselves as something original, or even be accomplished as men.
Yeah, it's that is such an interesting quote to me, because she was so accomplished. I mean, she had a huge legacy in the scientific world. I just think there wasn't really a precedent of people, of women understanding, or seeing themselves as, they certainly were not at this point really thinking about professional, I can make this into a career, I can advance the knowledge, the technical knowledge of this field that I'm so interested in. Often it was like they were just following their interest as much as they could, and there really wasn't like an expectation or often like the desire to present that in a way that we would say is like professionalized today, like in the sense of technical knowledge. So I don't know if it was imposter syndrome or it was just like she just viewed herself as, I'm learning, I'm in the path of these scholars that came before me, and these things that I've been able to accomplish are not original because they're sort of sparked by other people's ideas or whatever. But that's, I mean, that's kind of just intellectual like exchange, is you're always sparked by someone's ideas. So I think it might just be that there was really no model for how to be an intellectual scientific woman when it was so dominated by men, and also very kind of scattered and haphazard. As I said, those professional bodies really didn't begin to kind of take authority and play the role that they would come to play until like later in the 19th century. So this was just a time when it was very, there weren't any kind of standards or ideas that people could look back to say this is a path that you can take. So it's interesting. I'd love to peer in her mind and be like, how could you think that about yourself? I mean, you were a great scientist, and yeah, we still know your name today. And
So the next part is a comment question, but then it prompted a question from the audience.
sure.
So, question comment. I don't think Caroline Herschel ever married. Her brother William Herschel moved to Bath as a musician. She followed him to help in his music business.
Thank you. Thank you for correcting me. Yes, you're right. I knew she came to England with someone and I thought it was her husband, but you're right. She had the brother. Thank you for correcting me.
So astronomy was a hobby for them. Gradually, astronomy took over. Question, have you ever noticed if it was a lot of single women back then that eventually became scientific women? Or was it a lot of married women that had rich husbands? Or was it a mix, but all rich? Or did these single women had brothers that gave them access to all this information?
Yes, great question. I think it's some of all of the above. Definitely to be a married woman pursuing this stuff, your husband had to be somewhat, sympathetic or kind of give you some kind of approval about carrying this out. And there are examples of couples that would do scientific work together. I think I want to say Jane Marcet, Marcet. I want to say that she worked with her husband on different chemistry things, and they were, kind of collaborating on this stuff. Often it was a brother. So sometimes a woman's brother would be involved in, let's say, paleontology or something, and she would help. And same with wives too. She would help with the illustrations. And that would be a way that she was learning and contributing to his work. Sometimes women were reading texts that their husbands or brothers or fathers were producing and sort of, maybe making additions or kind of editing that. Like they had enough technical knowledge to help create those works, but they were never credited. Their names never appeared as like illustrator or anything. Everything just got really lumped into the male person who was doing the scientific work. And that made it challenging if you didn't have those male connections. Like Agnes Ibbotson is a really fascinating botanist of this time, because she really went after those like traditional, what we would say are traditional hallmarks of science, like journals, scientific journals and papers. And she was rejected when they found out that she was a woman. So she would send her stuff in and it would be like A. Ibbotson. She wouldn't reveal her first name and stuff. And she encountered a lot of resistance because she didn't have a husband who was like the vehicle for some of that work. It was just her on her own. And so eventually she would come up with these theories. She was very persistent, and she would come up with these theories and submit them, and they'd be like, no, like kind of dismiss it. And then a man would suggest the same thing, and it would be like published and, exalted, and oh gosh, look at this. And yeah, I think you did a lot better. You had a lot more kind of options if you had a supportive male person, or someone who had the resources and the inclination to help you participate in a way that you could. And certainly, like, I think Mary Somerville was upper class, and so she didn't need to, like, worry about making a living from this, but she could pursue those intellectual, she had that security to pursue those intellectual ideas that she was interested in.
Hmm. So the next question. A book with colored plates of botanical specimens must have been expensive. Were scientific books written by women available in lending libraries? If so, do we know whether they were as popular as novels or books of poetry?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have any data on that about like what they would cost. I do know that many of the plates were, I believe, hand colored at the time, which would have been, yeah, it would have made them expensive, because you had to employ that extra labor to do the coloring. I would say they were probably not as popular because they were really aimed at a particular subset of the population, which was households that were educating children. I would imagine they probably had these books in circulating libraries. And then also, as printing technology improved, like probably by the maybe 1820s, 1830s, there were maybe different techniques for getting these colored plates. Because like the later examples of these books were very popular and affordable for middle class families to buy. So yeah, definitely at first there would have been kind of a cost barrier to these kinds of works because they needed a lot of labor to produce them.
That's fascinating to find out. Next question. Is there any mention of Jane Austen's interest in botany or the natural world in her letters or writings about her?
Yeah, definitely. I haven't read the letters all the way through, but I know that she is attentive to the natural world. She's obviously lived in a rural area much of her life, and so you would definitely be exposed to, the natural world just by virtue of living where you did. And then also we know that, she and Cassandra and their mother would, make wine, make fruit wines, make probably like poultices and things for the household. So they probably had some of that kind of traditional herbalist knowledge, because they were producing products that could be used in the house for the family's consumption. I think we see a lot of like, they were very interested in gardening. In her letters, she talks about, the improvements that they're making to the garden. And I think she definitely enjoyed the natural world. I don't know of any evidence that she, like I said, studied from Wakefield's book or had an interest in like botanical illustration. I could be wrong. Would be fascinating to know, but yeah, I think she definitely had an enjoyment and an informal interest in the natural world and plants.
Next question. Wow, if Priscilla Wakefield was middle class, is she equivalent to the middle class of modern day? Or was the middle class more closer to the upper class back then?
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard because everyone had servant, like there was such a wide swath of people that had servants and relied on domestic help. And today we look at that and we're like, oh, that means you must be like more upper class. I think what was going on in the Regency world and the Georgian world is that labor was very easy to come by. Domestic servants were easy to come by, and that makes it hard to use our traditional or our modern kind of markers of social class. I would say that the Wakefields were probably squarely middle class at that time. And then they were also probably determined to sort of stay there, to not obviously slip into destitution because of Edward Wakefield's business losses or difficulties. One thing I read about the Regency era is that labor was cheap and goods were more expensive than they are today. So that's hard because we sort of have the reverse in our society where goods are abundant and cheap, and you don't hire labor as often, or it's more expensive. So I would say probably like squarely middle class for their time, and really wanting to sort of maintain that status.
Thank you for answering that. Next question. It sounds like Priscilla Wakefield had to step up and be the primary financial provider for her family, as it seems like her husband wasn't that good. Being a scientific woman, a sneaky but socially acceptable way for women back then to be financial providers for their families?
Yes, totally. Yeah, if you were like financially had a financial reason to be pursuing this stuff, you were respectable like in an instant, because you were not doing what you were doing purely for your own, glorification or fame, or I'm really just interested in this and I feel like I have to share this knowledge. It's like it made you respectable. And I think there were probably, women that were pursuing both, they had both motives for putting their work out there. But yeah, I think that even goes back to like the Renaissance, this idea that like you can enter the public sphere if you're motivated by this altruistic, I need to help my family, and I need financial security type of thing. It made it much easier. I think that was probably more of a challenge for women who didn't have that drive, that reason driving them to create their work. So yeah, definitely important to her legacy and her writing. That's the reason she wrote.
That makes sense. Next question. Did Adam Smith ever reply to her, Priscilla Wakefield's book?
That is interesting. I don't know that he did. I really don't know, like if there was ever a dialogue or kind of a back and forth between them. And I don't know enough about his philosophy to know if it ever evolved beyond kind of this traditional tangible goods idea as being the product of labor. I mean, I would say we're still probably having debates in our society now about like what's the value, does everything need to be all labor need to be measured in economic terms? Is there, an economic number we can put on unpaid work and things like that? So yeah, I don't know if he was ever interested enough in the question of like what women were contributing to reply to her, but that would be interesting to look at to see if there was ever a modification in his ideas.
Next question.
Oh, sorry, I have a dog barking.
Next question. Did her travel books mention exotic plants that British ships were discovering in Africa or Brazil or Hawaii?
Sorry, got my audio back on. I don't know if there was ever really a focus on botany in those books. I think it would require her correspondent to be looking at those things, because she was not there. She couldn't, like, if she had gone to those places, she probably could have recorded, this plant was here, I saw this plant. But she was relying on secondhand sources. So I think her primary source would have had to be paying attention to that as well. She probably did some reading, there was probably information coming in newspapers and different books and maybe magazines that talked about these exotic plants. I don't know if it was ever a focus of those books or if it was just kind of mentioned in passing. But yeah, definitely, it was really interesting. She was just sort of using the source material to create these accounts of different places that she never saw, she never went to.
Yeah, that's amazing. She did.
Yeah.
So the next question. Do we know whether Edward Knight had Wakefield's books in his library at Chawton House?
Oh, great. Great question. So I did an essay version of this talk for Persuasions, for the journal Persuasions. And while I was researching that, I found a record of Wakefield's book in the Chawton library, and I was all excited. I was like, this shows that like Jane Austen read this book probably, or like her family had it, or whatever. But to my knowledge, they did not have that book at the time. They have that book now in the library, but it's my understanding that that's a really recent collection, like within the last 20 years or 25 years. So they're probably acquiring books that like would have been used commonly at that time or would have been available at that time. But yeah, the Chawton House, like it is in the Chawton House library, but I think it's a modern acquisition of that book. I looked at the website Reading with Austen to see if I could find the Wakefield book, and I think that shows the Knight family library as she would have experienced it, or like as it was at that time. I don't know all the details of that, but I know that that website didn't bring up the Wakefield Botany book or any Wakefield books. So it's a kind of a mystery about whether that whether they were ever exposed to each other's work. And like, did Wakefield read Jane Austen? I mean, she lived past Jane Austen's death and, you know, was educated and literate, and she enjoyed theater. So did she read Jane Austen, and what did she think about Jane Austen? I mean, it's really interesting to think about the possibilities there.
I think you might have answered this along the way, but it's just along the same lines. Like, do we know if any of her books were found in Gomersum library?
Yeah, I think that was the other place. That's the Reading with Austen website that you can look at the Godmersham library contents, and you can search for different things. I think that's the one that she would have known in her life. You know, it shows books that would have been in the library when she lived there, because I think people who had those extensive libraries often had a log of what they had. And so, and even sometimes like it's on this shelf, you know, kind of like an index, like this book is on this shelf. And so I think they're using those sources to maybe recreate the library as it would have been. But I don't know. That project seems to be books that she knew, and I couldn't find Wakefield in that at all. So
Okay.
it's be fascinating to find out. But
Last two questions. Is there any connection to Queen Victoria being on the throne and women being shut out of societies or discouraged from working outside the home?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Queen Victoria was so interesting because, yeah, she was very traditional. She was very, you know, considered herself sort of, you know, in this role of queen without really, you know, it wasn't really a reflection of like her own ambition or her own ideas about women. And so I think she was fairly traditional in her own views of like what women should be doing. And yet she herself had this very extraordinary set of duties that would not have been the case for any other women at that time. I do think she was often used as an example of, you know, our queen believes this, and sort of used, you know, they used her views to kind of tamp down maybe movements towards different roles for women, or greater, you know, participation by women. But it's interesting because, yeah, she was herself very involved in public life, as she had to be as the queen. And it's also interesting that they made an exception in the fellowship of the Royal Society for her. So she was the only woman. I said that women weren't admitted until 1945, and they weren't, except for Queen Victoria, who they made like an honorary fellow. Like that's what you had to do to get into the society at that time, was be the queen. Yeah, it's really interesting because it does like her life is kind of an example of public participation and shaping public, you know, being very much in the public eye, and shaping maybe policy or whatever. And and yet she had these very traditional views of, like, I think she was against the whole movement of women trying to get the right to vote and things like that. And the Married Women's Property Act revisions that were taking place at that time. So yeah, she was interesting. She was an example of like a strong, woman who did a lot of things and was very capable, but also kind of believed that women should sort of stick to these traditional boundaries. So yeah.
All right, last question. Not a question. Thank you so much for introducing yet another woman of science to us.
Thank you for being here with us today, and yeah, for your attention. I'm sorry we ran so long, but man, it's such an interesting topic. She was so interesting, and just thank you all for your attention today and the great questions. Before I sign off, I just wanted to say that a little bit more about the book. So the book is out. It was not out when I gave the talk at the AGM. So I have copies here that I would love to get rid of. So if you're interested in ordering a copy through my website, I've provided a coupon code for you to get a 30% discount through March 15th. So you would be really doing me a favor, get some books out of my house. The book is about a fictional woman, as we mentioned earlier, who is interested in botany. There's a fictional version of Priscilla Wakefield. If you're interested in seeing that interpretation of it, please feel free to get a copy. It's also available through bookstores and libraries. They can usually get it if you work with them and request it. So you don't have to buy a copy, but if you want to, I'm giving you that discount. And yeah, I really appreciate all the participation and being able to do this with you from a distance. And I hope that our paths cross in person, maybe at an AGM or when I come down for the gala. And yeah, it'll be good. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. But this is also my contact information on here and the writing website where you can get the book or just sign up for my newsletter to stay informed about what I'm doing in the writing world. I think if you sign up for the newsletter, you should get a free, just a short story sent to you directly. So if you want that, just feel free to sign up. And yeah, I hope our paths cross at some point.
Oh, last minute question. Can we get your book autographed?
Yes, if you order through the website, I think there's a comment box where you just say what you want me to write and I will write it. Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
All right. Thank you so much, Cecily.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Yeah, have a great rest of your weekend, and I hope I hope we see each other at a Jane event sometime.
Yes. And I want to say, if anyone missed the beginning of the meeting where we talked about the gala, if you want to stay on and learn some more about it, and you can ask me questions or ask Nancy Gallagher questions. Sorry, I'm throwing that at you, Nancy. But you can learn more about the gala if you would either put it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself if you want to ask, or email me or Nancy for more information for our gala in May.
Thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Cecily. Someone asked, what date can we register for the May Gala? Registration will be open the first week of March, next week-ish, and there'll be an email that will go out with the dates for everything, the details for each event. There'll be 3 separately ticketed events, and you could register for 1 or 2 or all 3. And so all that information will be out next week. Thank you, Leah. And there's our website, Jasna Southwest, SW.com, and then upcoming events. We will have all the information posted there, along with local hotels that you can stay at if you aren't able to stay at the Hotel Dina, or you have Hilton Rewards points, you want to use it for somewhere else. And the hotel reservations will be open then also, yes. I believe you can call now for hotel reservations. Is that right, Nancy? Yes, the hotel reservations are open now. So if you wanted to call Hotel Dina and tell them you're with Jasna Southwest, then you would get the discount for the rooms that we have blocked out for our group. If you're wondering what you should wear to the ball, a couple of years ago, Leah wrote a article for us about finding Regency costumes. So you could sew one for yourself. You can ask someone to sew one for you. You could get one on Amazon. I know a friend bought one for like $30. It's polyester. If you don't care, that's fine. Thrift shops are great if you just find a dress that has the right kind of fabric and then accommodate it to make it look Regency style. That's an option too. So you don't have to dress up for the ball, but
Yeah,
if you want
I was
to,
just going to say, you don't have to dress,
Yeah.
you know, in Regency attire. Don't hold back because you don't have a gown.
Right. Yeah, you could be there in, well, I guess you could be there in jeans if you want to, but you know, a nice
Well,
a nice suit or fancy pants or regular dress, anything you want.
And since Bridgerton and other things are popular right now, you can find outfits. I called it the Miss Bates level of clothing for less than $50. You can find it even as low as $15 to $30 at discount stores. I can't name names, but local discount stores.
Yeah, if you want to get a little tiara, if you want to pretend to be whatever, a duke, a duchess, a lady, princess.
And Nella will be doing that workshop if you just want to make yourself a nice fancy headdress to wear.
I always imagine Miss Bingley walking into the ball, the Colin Firth version, the 1995 version, where she walks in, she has her turban with her big feather in it. Think of that. Yeah. Well, thank you, Anne. I appreciate that. It's a very nice comment. So yeah, gather your friends, ask to go to the gala with you, and it is going to be a very cool event. And again, you could come a day early, you could stay a day late. There's lots of things to do in the Pasadena, Hollywood, Southern California area. Yeah.